with this book in my hands, my father had made some passing remarks. He'd mentioned Himmler, the leader of the SS, and then his right-hand man, Heydrich, the protector of Bohemia and Moravia. And he'd told me of a Czechoslovak commando sent by London and an assassination attempt. He didn't know the details, and I had no reason to ask for them at the time, as this historic event hadn't yet taken hold of my imagination. But I had sensed in him that slight excitement he always gets when recounting something he finds striking. I don't think he was really aware of the importance he gave this anecdote. When I told him recently of my intention to write a book on the subject, all I sensed was polite curiosity without a trace of any particular emotion. But I know that this story has always fascinated him, even if it never made as strong an impression on him as it did on me. So one of the reasons I am embarking on this book is to reciprocate his gift, those few words spoken to an adolescent boy by a father who, at the time, was not yet a history teacher, but who, in a few awkward phrases, knew how to tell it. The story, I mean. History. 3. When I was still a child, well before the separation of the two countries, I already knew the difference between the Czechs and Slovaks. How? Because of tennis. For example, I knew that Ivan Lendl was Czech, while Miroslav Metzi was Slovak. And if Metzi, the Slovak, was a flashier player, more talented and likable than the cold, workman-like Czech Lendl, who was all the same the world number one for 270 weeks, a record he held until Pete Sampras topped him, holding the number one spot for 286 weeks, I had also learned from my father that, during the war, the Slovaks had collaborated while the Czechs had resisted. In my child's mind, this meant that all Czechs had been resistance fighters, and all Slovaks collaborators, as if by nature. Not for a second did I consider the case of France, which called into question such an oversimplification. Hadn't we, the French, both resisted and collaborated? Truth be told, it was only when I learnt that Tito was a Croat, so not all Croats had been collaborators, and perhaps not all Serbs had been resistance fighters, that I began to have a clearer understanding of Czechoslovakia's situation during the war. On one side, there was Bohemia and Moravia, in other words, the current Czech Republic, occupied by the Germans and annexed to the Reich, that is, having the unenviable status of protectorate and considered part of Greater Germany. On the other side there was the Slovak state, theoretically independent, but turned into a satellite by the Nazis. Obviously, this does not presuppose anything about any individual person's behavior. 4. On arriving in Bratislava in 1996, before going to work as a French teacher in a Slovakian military academy, one of the first things I asked the secretary to the military attaché at the embassy, after asking for news of my luggage, which had gone missing near Istanbul, concerned the story of the assassination. I learned the first details of the affair from this man, a warrant officer who had specialized in phone tapping in Czechoslovakia and, since the end of the Cold War, had been redeployed as a diplomat. First of all, there were two men involved in the attack, a Czech and a Slovak. I was pleased to find out that a representative of my host country had taken part in the operation, and that there really had been Slovak resistance fighters. I didn't learn much about the operation itself, except that one of the guns had jammed when they shot at Heydrich's car, and I discovered simultaneously that Heydrich was in a car at that moment. But it was above all what happened afterward that piqued my curiosity. How the two partisans had taken refuge with their friends in a church, and how the Germans had tried to drown them. A strange story. I wanted details, but the warrant officer didn't know much more. 5. A little while after arriving in Slovakia, I met a very beautiful young Slovak woman with whom I fell madly in love, and went on to have a passionate affair that lasted nearly 5 years. It was through her that I managed to obtain further information. Firstly, the protagonists' names, Jozef Gabcik and Jan Kubis. Gabcik was the Slovak, and Kubis